Hello, Internet. It's Gino, that Pinguino Grieco, here again with another episode of Deep Listens. And we are talking about Thumper today. Thump, thump. And I am joined by Billy, the Silver Beetle Rothert.
I suppose since I'm called Silver Fox in many other communities, due to my follicle complexion.
List those communities for us, would you, Billy?
Would you like them alphabetically or chronologically
community.
from the time that I joined?
The furry community. Foxes are big in the furry community. So are tigers. You ever look at Tony the Tiger's Twitter? It's chaos.
I mean, I can just imagine.
Yes.
Being such a cultural icon like that is, I'm sure, a burden.
That deep, sultry voice you hear is Pete, Tony the Tiger Busby.
I'll take that. I think I could be, if I were given the chance as a voiceover artist, I think I would be an excellent Tony the Tiger. And I would engage with that furry community that I feel like Tony is sadly neglecting right now.
What a weird way to start off. So we played Thumper.
We haven't
today.
started a podcast this well in ages.
Yeah, man, we are running on point. Squad goal.
Yes. Are we on Fleek?
Fleek, yes.
Now we need to start talking about a video game.
That's true. Okay, so we do not have feedback for this week, which is weird because we had a bunch of Russians download our Sonic podcast.
Yeah?
An inordinate number. I thought for a second that our...
Are we hacked?
Yeah, that's what I thought for a second. Like our podcast feed was compromised, but maybe Russia's just way into Sonic the Hedgehog.
Or maybe they just got wise on this golden intellectual content.
Right?
Not
you
that
need
episode.
to fill the days somehow in Russia.
That's true. So, no feedback. But if you want to be the person who leaves the feedback, you can go ahead and hit us up at Deep Listens Pod on Twitter. deeplistens.libsyn.com. We have comment sections on every one of our podcasts, and we also receive emails at deeplistenspodcast@gmail.com. So deeplistenspodcast@gmail.com. There's not an @ sign before the podcast thing. Complicated. So, Pete, you chose Thumper.
I did.
Why did you choose Thumper?
So, once again, in my one-man quest to undermine the very concept of VR, I wanted to pick a game that was seemingly, maybe not even seemingly, maybe explicitly designed for that platform and see if it could operate in another one. And I was also intrigued by a visual style that I'm sure we'll be unpacking throughout this podcast, so I won't say too much more about it now. But those would be my two main reasons. One, so I can hate on VR whenever possible. And two, intriguing visual style.
It's fair. So, Thumper. Billy, as you're wont to do, what are we dealing with Thumper?
All right, so we're going to start breaking into the story of Thumper.
Take notes, listeners. It's expensive.
Yeah. So, the story is you are a space beetle, and that's it.
You're flying through space.
Mm-hmm.
It's really more like you're flying through the last 30 minutes of 2001: A Space Odyssey. But yeah, you kind of get the gist. You're essentially on rails, and you're a space beetle flying through space. Bump into the beats of the deep galactic void, and you encounter some spoopy shit along the way. There we go.
Yeah, and this
story
game
totally unpacked.
This game was made by Drool, which is actually two former Harmonix developers. You might know Harmonix from Rock Band, Guitar Hero, Amplitude, and Frequency and Amplitude. Those games. So they are veterans of the rhythm game genre. And so this game is a rhythm game, basically.
Mm-hmm.
It is a what do they describe it? Rhythm violence.
Rhythm violence.
Rhythm
yes, that's the
violence.
And I thought that was one of the more, for as ludicrous as that name is, it's oddly accurate.
It is. As you play the game, it is very apt.
But
would you say it's also adroit?
I think adroit more would be a person term. Like a person is adroit, whereas a term is apt.
I was really hoping I could get some way.
I'm knee deep in the OED, man. Don't test me.
for me, the thing that jumped out immediately was how well this game communicates its mechanics without ever explicitly tutorializing. Every level up until level 6, I think, kind of adds a new mechanic. And each of those mechanics in the first level, there are sub-levels in each level, like 23, level 1-23, level 1-24. And generally speaking, in the first level or two of each sub-level, of the first sub-level of each level, they will unveil a new mechanic, force you to learn it just by making you play, and then it just assumes you know it from there on out. And I thought that this game was pretty darn good at teaching you without explicitly teaching you.
Yeah, and I agree with you wholeheartedly, Gino. I think it does do exactly what you're saying. But I think we do have to add that caveat that there really are only 2 buttons that they have to teach you. And I mean, they do a lot with those 2 buttons, but it's not a game where, like, just thinking of another game that's sort of known for its rhythm, something like Arkham Asylum, where you have a whole bunch of movements they're going to have to teach you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but in Thumper, so the controls are basically you press the X or A button to thump, which kind of hits to the beat, and then you have your directional pad or analog stick, depending on what you're using, and you either kind of slide into turns or jump lanes, kind of like in a audio surf kind of way, or you can also fly and kind of slam down. And you can only take off when it's kind of, if you think like audio surf, the little beat blocks come down the or Rock Band. There's kind of these notes that come down the note highway, and if you press A or X when that note is underneath your beetle, you get points for hitting on the beat, and you can kind of take off when you hit one of those notes and then slam down. And all of these, that's the entirety of the interactions in this game. It's just kind of
no, there's more than
beats.
that. There's other things you interact with.
There are other mechanical things, but in terms of your control of the beetle, it is turn.
Oh, true. Yeah, I guess.
Hit the beat, and then fly and slam down. That's pretty much all you do, but there are much more complex variations on this. There are
right. You just mix those things together to do something else.
Yeah, there are some segments where you have to. Oh, and also you can, if you hold down the X button or A button, you kind of. It's kind of like the truck stick in Madden.
Yeah, I mean, that's pretty accurate.
I was going to go more for like the lower your shoulder in Assassin's Creed kind of thing.
Yeah, you turn on the truck stick and you just break through different barriers and things, which is your main way of getting... There's like little obstacles that will be on the path, and that kind of lets you run through them. But they'll combine each of these mechanics in pretty unique ways, like, there's spikes on the ground, so you have to fly over them and then slam down on the other side, or there's rings that will come and force you to hit. You have to hit all the beats while the ring is there, and if it doesn't, it shoots you with laser beams. So all of these different mechanics kind of come together to give you... It makes almost... It's musical, but it's almost like... have you ever heard Sophie? She's there's a music person, a DJ, and a lot of sounds that person uses. I'm not sure if the gender of Sophie, but
I have no idea what you're talking about regardless.
They use a lot of weird, like, metal banging noises.
Like an industrial
PVC
kind
pipe.
of beat?
Like Stomp?
Not like Stomp, because it is still electronic music. But it's kind of arrhythmic and weird in the way that Thumper's sounds are.
Gotcha.
So what did you guys think of Thumper?
Well, I want to hit a couple of pieces while we're talking about mechanics, because they changed something during an update that I want to talk about.
Okay.
So
well, did you guys notice that each of the levels corresponds to the number of beats per measure?
Yes. I noticed that separately because I just started outside of the podcast taking a music class.
Oh.
So I'm now learning piano.
Way to better yourself, Billy.
I know. I'm just trying to go for that self mastery.
There you go.
And I have always played rhythm games like this, Guitar Hero, Rock Band, Audio Surf, stuff like that. And I noticed very quickly that beats changed, and I was like, how? These are changing. They're getting faster, but they're not just getting faster. And then I was like, oh wait, the level numbers. That's cool.
Yeah. And
It stops at 8 because they go to
it doesn't stop at 8. It stops at
or
9.
9, but
9's fucked up.
yeah, I'm sure.
Yeah, that was the thing for me, was just because it is the number of beats per measure is corresponds to the level. Level 1 was pretty good. Level 2, fine. 3 is a little weird. 4 was fine for me.
Great again.
5, horrifying. I was terrible on 5. I was terrible on 6. 7 was a pretty short level, but I was terrible. 8 came back, roaring back in 8. And then 9 was just like, I don't even know what's happening anymore.
I had no problem. I think I only had trouble on 5.
Yeah.
I mean, I had trouble with everything after like 1 or 2, but 1, I'm not really sure what a measure is, so that's probably part of the problem. And 2, I'm just not very good at rhythm games, which I neglect.
I just learned the definition for these terms.
Throw it out.
So
What's a measure, Billy?
A measure is, I guess, a length of time that, like a musical composition, it's like it's segmented into these specific lengths of time, and like the time signature is how many beats happen in that particular measure. So in this case, the measures stayed kind of the same, but the beats per measure went up. So imagine the same length of time, but cutting into different fractional values.
Yeah, so it's like, instead of going like bum, bum, it goes like bum, bum. And then eventually it's 9, and it's just loud chaos. 9 was difficult. For me,
an audio shitstorm.
I'm used to anything in units of 2 or multiples of 2, but then once you get into multiples of 3, I'm worthless.
I was okay for multiples of 3 because I played Wind Waker, and you play the Wind Waker, most of their basic songs, in 3/4 time.
Okay.
That's true for all of the Zelda games, isn't it?
No.
It's definitely true for Ocarina of Time.
It's actually in 4/4 time, but there's half notes in most of the songs. So with those 3-note songs, one of them's a half note.
So 2 quarter notes, 1 half note.
Yes.
Right.
Gotcha. Okay, that makes sense.
Like Zelda's Lullaby, for example, is probably written in 2 half notes for their first notes, and then like a dotted half note with a rest for the last note.
I found Thumper, that was one of the more interesting things, was how much just changing up the levels and changing up the beats kind of added some variation to the gameplay for me specifically. And then being able to actually keep track of what the meters were because of the kinds of obstacles they would throw at you. Like, I remember in level 9, it would be a lot of sequences were like 8 beats in a row, like one time you'd thump, then you'd break through like 3 things, then you'd thump again, fly through 3 things, and then there'd be like a curve. I'm like, okay, there's one full measure. And the game would actually just get more and more intense. It felt like... So have you guys ever played Audio Surf?
Mm-hmm.
No.
It's a game that you can feed MP3s into, and it'll make kind of these rhythm game levels for you. And occasionally, I played a decent amount of Audio Surf in college, and every once in a while, I'd feed a song into it, and it'd just be a nightmare. It would be just the fastest, crazy song, and it felt like that. It eventually got to that point, where all of a sudden it's like, you're moving way too quick, my brain can hardly process it, but I'm just holding on by the skin of my teeth.
Just feeling the rhythm, man.
I have a program that I'm using to assist me learning piano, and it's called Synthesia. And it's effectively like Guitar Hero of the piano. But I think when they were like crowdfunding it or something, or whenever they were developing it, they called it like Piano Hero, and they got a cease and desist order, so they called it Synthesia instead. So it's essentially that. Like I have to take MIDI files and feed it into this program, and then it makes the notes fall like on Guitar Hero or something. And I'll put in like, hey, like let's go grab, I don't know, some Billy Idol or some Beatles or whatever, and then I pick like a random song that's maybe a little bit newer, and it's just chaos because it tries to put the bass line and the guitar and the vocals and the drums all on the piano. So you'd have to have 12 arms to play the song that it actually tries to have you play.
That's awesome. So one of the things that I've noticed with Thumper is just how incredibly... So I found it was pretty forgiving for a rhythm game.
Yes.
They
actually gave you like 1 hit point, or sorry, 2 hit points.
Yeah, you get that shell.
You have a beetle shell, and you can get the shell back a number of different ways. Each sub-level ends with kind of a checkpoint that will always have a note that will give you your shell back. So you can only ever have 2 hit points, which means, you know, if you screw up once, you only ever need to hit one of those notes to get back to full, quote-unquote, full health. But you can also get your shell back by hitting kind of a note combo, just keeping a combo going, and then flying up and slamming down on a note, and that'll kind of transform a regular note into a restorative health point restoring note. And I found that was pretty forgiving for if I made a mistake here or there. If I played well enough, it could get me back.
It essentially let you compensate for a small mistake by adding more skill. And I think mechanics like that in games where you're looking for mastery is fine, because not every player is trying to S rank every level. You know, I got to a point where I didn't really care about S ranking anymore, because for the purposes of this podcast, I wanted to experience the game first, and if I want to S rank it, I'll go back and do that. Like, I came very close to S ranking like the first 3 levels, but eventually I was like, all right, I don't really care about this anymore. And that mechanic let me be more casual, because I knew that I could get my health back, like you were saying, and just enjoy a game that was fun and beats.
Yeah. And you could kind of slop your way through Thumper in a way that a game like Furi, which we played a couple weeks ago, you can't. If you screw up, that game's just like, nah, you're fucking dead. Sorry. Sorry, you're dead. Also, redo
Start
the
over
fight
from the beginning. Yeah.
Yeah. Also, fuck you. Thumper, generally speaking, you could screw up. Since you could screw up twice, and there's only a couple of different things that actually damage you. You can miss a turn. If you screw up on a turn, that damages you. If you aren't using your truck stick when you run into a little barrier, that'll damage you. And then there are spikes occasionally and other hazards. Like, there are snakes that'll come for you occasionally.
Yeah, those are sweet.
And the ring. So that's
and
5 things that damage
and the
you.
ring. That's it. But that's it in, like, the whole game. Is the ring, the walls, the snakes, spike pit, and then not holding the truck stick when you need to. But otherwise, everything else that you hit in this game is a bonus. Like, for example, when you fly, you can hit some, like, kind of flying barriers.
Archway, ring type things.
Yeah. And if you run through those, it's just bonus points. If you perfectly time your turns with the beat, that just gives you bonus points. You don't have to do it in order to survive. And by making that choice, it meant that even if I didn't get the beat, which in level 9 I lost the plot with a lot of the sounds, but I was able to still make progress because I could just go, nope, I'm just gonna hit the turns and I'm not gonna die. Which is something that in a lot of rhythm games, or not rhythm games, but in a lot of overly difficult games, they just demand perfection of you by that point.
And this is why I think this game counts as like a rhythm violence game, because you can take a few hits in any other slasher beat 'em up kind of game, and you don't have to go immediately to the game over screen. But here, it's kind of like a battle. You have essentially some hit points, and you can take a few hits and not instantly die. A game that's like, I mean, again, it's like Guitar Hero and Rock Band are like that too. If you miss a couple of notes, it's not game over, but eventually you'll hit a game over screen, but you can win yourself back.
Yeah, you can skill your way through it, which I thought was pretty great.
So now I want to circle back now that we've talked about sort of all of the in-game interactables. I want to talk a little bit about outside game interact. No, this is not really outside game, but like I want to talk about control scheme and some other UI stuff. If we have a second.
Sure.
I wanted to hit some stuff with just the mechanics, if that's
Yeah. Okay. Let's do that first, and then we'll circle back to controls.
yeah, because some of the UI stuff I want to definitely cover too. But since we were talking about mechanics, I really enjoyed that each of the different types of obstacles had they had different sounds associated with them. Generally speaking, the barriers that you broke through were kind of like the archways were kind of like a hi-hat.
And the barriers were kind of like a snare.
Yeah, kind of like a snare.
The thumbs were definitely the bass.
Yeah, the thumbs were the bass line. I don't know what you would describe the turns, because some of the turns were definitely like some kind of medium drum, but some of them you would stay on for kind of to hold a note.
Yeah.
So it's not really necessarily a
then
drum.
They would turn into like a synthesizer, like building up before the beat drop.
Yeah. It wasn't really like percussive at that point.
It wasn't. I don't think the turns were very percussive.
The turns weren't percussive, but then when you would fly and slam down, that was kind of a cymbal crash. Not in sound, but in effect.
Yeah, that's fair.
You'd kind of build up to this big slam, though the sound would be kind of like the heaviest bass drum. And each one of these sounds, I loved the way that they would combine them and make music out of what sounds like just, chaos.
In isolation, these would just be kind of like crashes and bangs that wouldn't make any sense. But when you put them in these contexts, when you have them adjacent to one another, it does make rhythm. It does make sound almost music. I probably wouldn't give it credit of full music.
I think it's
But
music.
What?
This combinatory aspect is key, though, because like Gino, you're sort of saying, you're free to sort of skip certain obstacles as you want. Like if you don't want to thump everything, you don't really have to thump everything. So if points aren't really your main focus, what this does is it provides an alternative reward structure. Is that you're rewarded with better music the more precise you play the game, let's say.
Yeah, and that was something that I started to notice after the first level. If you mess up, if you miss a thump, if you, instead of getting a perfect turn, you do a regular turn, each of these different mistakes you can make, kind of in a rock bandy way, will result in the song being distorted a little bit. Like, when you hit a barrier, when you break through a barrier, if you missed the thump before hitting those barriers, it's kind of a hollow sound instead of that snare, that tight snare sound. If you make a turn without making it perfect, you'll get the turn sound, but if you hit it perfect, there'll be a turn sound and kind of like a drum hit in at the right time. Even flying through the arches, like they take on a different sound. So the game, not only does it sound better because you're hitting all the notes themselves sound better when you're hitting them correctly, which I thought was a level of feedback that I've just not really seen, because in a lot of rhythm games, you're playing a recognizable song. So if you miss, it's just kind of like in Guitar Hero, they'll make an off-key, an off-key noise, a random note instead of the song that you should be hearing. But since this game is kind of building songs out of its own sound library, out of its own sound vocabulary, they can use these different sounds to communicate, oh, you're screwing up, oh, you're doing it perfectly. And those few times, it was only a few times in the entire game that I was playing perfectly for extended periods, it sounded great. And then there were times, like on level 9, where it barely sounded like a song, and I was just surviving.
They sort of did a thing where you got positive feedback when you survived, but you got just even better positive feedback when you were great. I think that's in opposition to a game like Guitar Hero or Rock Band, where if you miss notes, you get this kind of awful sound. It's kind of negative feedback. And so you have to, like, there's no way you can make the sounds sound better. You just play the song, and if you are less than perfect but hit all the notes, maybe if you're in like a DDR system where you would just be getting only goods or fines on the notes instead of marvelous or perfect, you get no extra reward for being marvelous or perfect in Guitar Hero Rock Band. But in this game, if you have just one level up of perfection, you do get like a next level positive response. There's no negative feedback except for dying, I guess.
Yeah,
Which I do mess up a lot.
Except for the death.
Except for the death part.
And this game also has a pretty strong visual language for when you're succeeding. When you screw up, the note track starts to get darker and redder, and your beetle just kind of takes on a drab kind of shade as the level gets darker. And some of the kind of loud thrumming sounds that are always playing and kind of making you... It made me nervous after a while. It would get me a little tense. That gets louder, but when you're playing well, your beetle kind of becomes rainbow. The track lights up in this kind of blue light, and when you do things like the flying thump, the flying slam, it makes the whole note track shake and turn rainbow, and just the game almost hitches for a second to let you know how hard you're hitting it. And that visual feedback combined with the audio feedback for me was what made this game truly special when I enjoyed it. It's a level of attention to detail to the finer points of rhythm game making that I was like, these people had to have made a rhythm game before. And, okay, they're veterans from harmonics. But I thought that it really stuck out when it worked. When it worked, it felt like drugs, I imagine.
Oh, boy.
Guess
What was your guys' favorite? Okay, so we had bosses in these levels, right?
Mm-hmm.
The last boss at every level, I think, was kind of lame. It was like this. What?
It was the same one.
Yeah, it was like this spooky, like Statue of Liberty head type deal. Had like a skull with like spikes on it, and it had
didn't get to
eyes.
the end, right?
Not to the very, very end.
Yeah, he gets
What?
more fucked up every time you see him.
Yeah,
he
I mean,
looks cool on the very last level when he's like a
six-eyed monster.
Yeah, when it's like a ring sort of thing. But I agree with Billy.
The point that I'm trying to make is I got sick of looking at that guy.
Yeah,
but
I'd
in
agree.
every level, there's like a midway boss, and those were just way cooler.
Yeah, I liked in theory the boss kind of getting bigger and bigger and bigger. I don't know that I love the design. I think the last two levels I liked, or the last three levels, I really liked the spike-headed guy.
Yeah.
But
I'll give
earlier
that.
on, he was kind of blah. But in the last three, it's like, at one point, he goes from having spikes on his head to just giant spiked tentacles coming out of him.
Mm-hmm.
Then the next one, I think, is giant spiked tentacles and his eyes start glowing red. And then
Yep.
he has 3 eyes, all glowing red. And then he has 6 eyes, and he's a giant, horrifying circle monster.
Yeah.
And I thought that was pretty cool visually.
It was an improvement, but I still agree with Billy that it's sort of, and this is a critique I'm going to level at the visual art through the whole game, is that I found it, on the whole, fairly repetitive. Like, for a game where visual design is going to be so important, I'd like to see a little bit more variation with it.
And we
Yeah.
got a little bit of that variation in the midway bosses. Like they did something that made the game mechanic introduced in that level. It sort of said, this is like your final exam, and there's going to be a boss here that will challenge you in some unique way to do that. The two that stood out to me the most was, I think it's in level 4 when they introduced the dunks,
Yeah.
and you had to fight.
And the little shield things.
Yeah, they're like little shield monsters that just said you have to do a thump to like pop me off the track, and then you can attack the boss. Then there was boss number 6 that sort of etched its way through the world and turned the track as you went through
Yeah,
it.
Fuck that.
Those
thing.
were way cool mid bosses, but then I said, well, I know I'm just going to get to the final boss and it's going to be kind of lame because it's just going to be this spooky monster head again that, yeah, he gets kind of scarier in levels 6, 7, 8, 9, but I just found it to be not something to look forward to.
Yeah, the
But
monster
the midway
head,
bosses I looked forward to.
the monster head is just kind of a difficult section of track, and you have to hit it perfectly. Whereas the mini bosses would have gimmicks, like there was one mini boss that would get really close to you and then pull away, and so it would leave, you'd see one note, but since it's super close, you can't see what's coming up next. And then it would pull away, and it's like, oh shit, there's like 3 turns, and I have like a second to process. Which is pretty, and they all had very unique visual designs. Like the one that you talked about, Billy, looked kind of like a triangle-y sort of shape, and he would
The one that etched the world?
Yeah, it would
Yeah.
like get slammed like a triangle peg into a triangle hole, and then just kind of shake and move, and it looked kind of robot-y. But then there were some that looked like giant flying starfish, and one would look like ice.
Yeah, I liked that icicle. The snowflake one was probably my favorite.
Yeah, I
Yeah, that's
like
cool.
the starfish.
Starfish was cool too.
Something else that I wanted to talk about was a little bit of mechanics here is, and this sort of ties into the areas that we discussed about when the game rewards you for perfect playing, and when the game says, you can just sort of muddle through here, as long as you don't die, you get to the next level. Did you guys ever encounter the circle guy that laser beamed you when you missed and did the following? Did you guys ever intentionally take a hit like immediately?
Not intentionally. I always just went, I have a second health point, so if I screw up, whatever, but...
So in most cases, that boss would just leave you alone if you took a hit. He wouldn't stick around to hit you twice.
Huh.
So in a lot of levels, I would say, oh, this guy's coming. I'm just going to eat shit on the first thump. And I can, because the rest of the level, or the rest of that segment would be hard if he was there over top of me. But now I can just relax. And I can play better because I can just do thumps and dunks and get my health back immediately. And at that point, I didn't care about taking a hit and lowering my score. It wasn't important to me anymore. So I could just say, oh, well, this guy's here. I'm just going to relax, eat shit the first chance I get, and then he'll leave me alone.
Yeah, but the thing that I noticed was with those, once you get used to the sound of the ring actually highlights the notes in front of you, and it will always make the same sound and have the same timing for the notes that it's highlighting, which actually just let me not have to think about when I need to press the button to thump. Because it basically tells me, okay, after I make the sound, it's a second later. You hit the button, always. And so some of the time, it was weird. Sometimes I was thinking about this game in terms of visually, when do I need to press this? And sometimes I got into the rhythm, and I just was able to feel, okay, I should press it now.
I didn't like that.
Those rings allowed me to just go off of what I'm hearing without having to think about it visually. Because even if, some weird bullshit like the screen shaking or, you're hitting a couple turns very quickly, those can make it very distracting and difficult to hit your thumps on time. As long as I had that ring noise, I could hit it by the end of the game. It took me a little while to get that timing down, but once I did, it was like, oh, this is actually a obstacle that lets me turn my brain off instead of make me anxious about hitting the right notes. And that was the thing that I noticed about the ring. At first, I thought, oh shit, this is where it's going to make me pay for playing sloppy, and this is going to be miserable. It's going to turn into Fury. Like, if you screw up, you just die. But I found that the ring, they employed it really wisely. They used it early on in some of the later levels to make sure you knew what the hell the time signature was. It would be like the second sub-level. And it would, here's the time signature, and you have to hit it, or else you'll take damage. Which I thought was a really intelligent way. If I'm understanding how they deployed it correctly, that seems to be what they were doing. They were making sure you at least nailed it once.
Mm-hmm.
So, Billy, you wanted to talk about the patches?
Yeah, so it's good that we talk about it right after this, because one of the patches and updates that they made to the game were sort of, in my opinion, focused on the ring enemy. So there was two things. First of all, they made lots of like bug fixes and patches and stuff that you would normally expect from a developer to make sure the game is like good quality. But I think the devs here went an extra mile for the players, and they added two things, actually three things. I'll talk about them all. They added three things that I think are stepping it up, going the extra mile for the players. So the first is easiest to talk about. They added essentially New Game Plus. They said you get to play a golden beetle instead of a silver beetle, and you take one hit and you die. Or sorry, no. It's you still have two hits, but if you ever do die, your whole run is gone.
And it's different parameters for how you get the shield back.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's like faster, harder. It's essentially nightmare mode. But I like it when developers add stuff like that because it's saying to players, if you love this game for everything that it is, we give you more of that stuff. The only thing that I say that they could add along these lines would be a way to import your own sounds in like a very like vanilla looking track that didn't have to be so dynamic. But they did something kind of like Audio Surf, and you could plug in some MP3 or MIDI file, and it could roughly create like one of your songs. That'd be really cool too.
Oh, okay. That is a suggestion, not
a
a
suggestion that does not exist yet, but along the same lines of adding what they call Play Plus, they could do something like that. That'd be so cool. But what I'm trying to get at is, in this case, they said to players, if you love Thumper, if you love this game so much, we're going to give you a way to love it more. And I like when devs do that. Then two other things that they did that were updates was, one, they changed something on the controller. And I think this is brilliant. They added a button, and it just did thump again. But they explained why they did it. They said people gave us feedback that they like playing our game, but their thumb gets too tired if they have to just keep mashing X button over and over again and holding it and stuff. So they gave you one of the trigger buttons to also thump. And so if your hand got tired, you could just use the trigger button to thump as well.
Sense.
That was something I didn't notice because I had a bruise on my hand, on my thumb after playing too much.
So they literally
still have a bruise on my.
They changed their control scheme to say, hey, we want people to play our game, not get hurt by it. So we're going to add something to the controller to make it easier for you guys.
Good move.
On the controller, you can use the joystick, like the analog stick, or the D-pad. Again, I used the D-pad every time it went to the multi-track section, but I used the controller every other part of the game. Sorry, the joystick every other part of the game. Did you guys ever make switches like that?
No, I used the joystick the whole time.
I stuck to the D-pad.
Yeah, like it's sort of a preference. I used both. And then the last thing that they added, I really like that controller change. The last thing that they added was a way to fast forward through death animations.
Oh.
If you held the thump button, you just fast forward and just immediately start the level again much, much faster.
Oh, I didn't notice that. I think I did that by accident a couple times, but I didn't notice that.
Well, it didn't exist before. So that was the thing that they directly added. They directly added the essentially Play Plus. They added the extra button so your hands wouldn't get hurt or tired, and they added speed up death animations. And I thought that was great because so often when you are about to get laser beamed by the circle, you're like, oh, fuck, just let me start over again, but you can't. And then they said, we can let you fast forward through this so you can start over the level faster. If you want to see the full animation, you can. They didn't delete it. They just gave you a skip option, which is awesome.
Yeah, and I just thought that the speed with which you can get back into this game and the number of checkpoints that they give you just makes this a lot more forgiving and a lot more beatable than a game like Furi. There was nothing more upsetting to me than getting to the last part of a difficult boss and then dying and realizing that the fight's going to be another 7 minutes. And, the first 5 of it is stuff I've mastered. Versus Thumper, where even on bosses where you kind of have to be perfect, you only have to complete maybe 3 or 4 segments perfectly. And that, if you do it correctly, the first time will only take maybe 2 minutes. And it was a big difference.
When I was fighting bosses, even mini bosses, you could miss one of your thumps and it would say, okay, you messed up the series, you can't score a hit on the boss now. But instead, they just immediately said, all right, you're just going to finish the cycle and then it's going to seamlessly start up again. You didn't have to actually reload the level. It would just continue. You wouldn't take damage. You wouldn't have to reload. It would just find a way to elegantly and seamlessly blend the beginning to the level with wherever you ended up being.
Yeah, and that lets you practice on the sequences even though you're not playing successfully.
Right. That's like you never actually stop. You don't have to hit restart checkpoint. You don't have to reload the No, it just seamlessly starts you again on the same track. Real cool.
Mm-hmm. Was there any other stuff you wanted to cover on that, Billy?
On the mechanics and the updates, I think we hit it, but there was one other thing. It's slipping my mind now. It'll probably come back to me.
Okay. So, Pete, you had a couple of things that you wanted to talk about.
I did. Well, let's start with sort of a genre question, right? So this game is sort of billed as, I want to say horror, right? I think it's a horror game, but I want to make an argument that it's a specific type of horror, right? And that type of horror would be cosmic horror. So when people try to describe cosmic horror, they usually use the same example, right? They look at Lovecraft and his Cthulhu monster, right? That's cosmic horror. It's the idea that sort of you're encountering something that's inexplicable, that's sort of so far beyond the scope of human experience, whether it's in scale, time, power, whatever, that at least for Lovecraft, you basically just go insane. And I feel like that's what Thumper's trying to do, right? This isn't a horror game like, oh my God, zombies are chasing me. This is more a horror game in like, how do we account for, the cosmos? How do we account for how insignificant we might be in sort of this larger scheme? And I think that's sort of how it's operating. It's a question of sort of inexplicable cosmic horror as opposed to, let's say, thriller horror.
Yeah, and this game, so I think it operates in both spaces in different ways. The visual aesthetic is definitely, it draws from cosmic horror. Like the track at certain points where you're, when there are lulls in this game, you'll maybe play like 6 levels in a row, and each level, as soon as you finish one, it just goes straight into it, and it just keeps hitting you. And then at a certain point, there'll be kind of a lull where you'll get kind of an orchestral interlude, and then the track will like grow tentacles and arms, and it depends on what level you're on, what those tentacles and arms look like. But, it could be spindly spider leg looking things, or kelp.
It could be looking like a mechanical gear system.
Yeah, it could look like octopus arms. It could look like, geometry. Like a line graph coming off the edge. And when those moments happen, you feel like you're in some otherworldly place. It doesn't look like anything you've seen before. And to do that with what is essentially a note highway and a rhythm game, I thought was really cool. And then the bosses themselves, I think, operate in that space as well. They're these kind of big... I could imagine if you were in VR, they'd be terrifying. They're very visually interesting, and they are so visually loud that it makes this game that is already kind of overwhelming even more overwhelming, because you have to take in this gigantic creature in front of you.
And I think the key here is that even as these things are sort of so abstract or, let's just say weird, even as these things are so weird, they still are almost recognizable, right? So it's dealing with a phenomenon, or something close to a phenomenon, apophonia, right? Apophonia is the tendency amongst humans, right, to see patterns, right? We're always looking at patterns where like things may be meaningless, right? This isn't quite the same thing, but it's similar in that you're seeing these, like think about the way you describe them, Gino, as sort of spider legs or kelp tentacles or even, gear shifts. You're trying to fit them into a rational context. You're trying to use paradigms you've established so you can sort of understand, okay, here's what these things are. But the game just doesn't quite let you do that. They're just similar enough to encourage that comparison and different enough to shut it down. So you're sort of left with this weird liminal space where you can't really account for these things.
Yeah, and I found that to be some of the most interesting part of it, because the whole time I was like, what is this place going to be? Am I going to be underwater? Am I going to be something recognizable? I always wanted it to be something recognizable. But they were always just weird and abstract enough to make me distanced. And so I never really felt comfortable with my surroundings, and I thought that they were visually interesting, but not necessarily... Maybe it's just my own desire to see things represented in a, way that mimics the real world. And I was like, yeah, this is cool looking, but it doesn't look like X, or it doesn't look like this real world object that I would expect it to look like.
Well, I guess it's sort of you can't really appreciate Thumper all the way when you're in game and you're kind of panicking to survive. But if
Yeah.
you can go back and play an earlier level, which I did, after I got pretty far into the game, I started playing like the old levels again. I was like, wow, this experience was almost a 180. Like, I'm not stressed at all. I'm way better at the game, so I'm just dominating the actual gameplay. But I can take a second to like not look at the track and see what's around me. And they do a lot of work with the deepest background, not just what's on you right now on the track, but and also not what's coming up in the next few seconds, but way in the background, like the subtle like blurring of colors and lights that keep that depth there, that keep that cosmic depth. And without it, if they just had sort of a black background, it would seem like incomplete or hollow of a world. But this gives it a completeness that I think lends well to its otherworldly like atmosphere.
Yeah, and what Billy mentioned about that tension when you're playing and it kind of distracting you from the visual effects, that was where I think it plays in traditional horror, like that kind of thriller horror. Because you are just, at certain points in this game, you feel like you're hanging on by a nail.
Instantly. I'm talking like milliseconds away from death.
Yeah, the game is just beating you over and over again. Like some of the bosses, there was one boss, I think it was level 8, I was just stuck. Like I wasn't dying, but I also couldn't hit it perfectly. And so I just kept hitting it and failing and hitting it and failing, and it just kept me in this loop where I wasn't dying, but I knew if I screwed up at any point, I would be sent back to the beginning. And so it was just, my hands were sweating. I was literally sweating because I knew if I felt safe, but I also knew if I let my guard down for even a second, I would fail. And it's a combination of kind of the background sounds that kind of, they draw, I think, from kind of a thriller sound library. You know, like this discordant sound that's in the background that just is constantly, the volume is getting higher and the note is getting louder. And it kind of starts to pull away from the sounds that you're creating with your beetle. And it just makes it super duper tense. Which is interesting to see it visually playing in one space, and then in feel, it moves between kind of this cool, expressive musical experience and then this tense, hectic boss experience. And even some of the levels, they stop being necessarily as rhythmic and start being more violent.
And that's where those interludes come back, and that's sort of, you know, you talk about how it feeds in that larger sort of cosmic level, but those interludes also enhance that sort of secondary thriller level, in that, like, even as you're, you know, resting, presumably, it's just anticipation waiting for that next series of obstacles to come.
Yeah. And I think that this game is one of the most well-paced that I've played in a while within a given level. They do a great job of, you know, they'll have a sequence. I'm thinking like levels 8 and 9. There were a couple of sequences where it was just maybe a minute or 2 or 3 of just crazy fast patterns and a lot of difficult syncopation and banks and stuff like that. And after all of that, maybe you get an interlude, or you get 2 levels that are very short, or 2 sublevels that are very short, and, you know, maybe it's 30 seconds or a minute. And so you feel like you're making good progress again after just banging your head up against a wall for maybe a minute, you know, a couple of attempts. So they do a nice job of rewarding you and making you feel like you're back in control after they wrested it away from you.
Yeah, so I was sort of surprised. Sorry, I guess I was frustrated at first, but then I felt good about it afterwards, that some levels were way long, like a minute or 2. And other levels are like 15, 20 seconds. Because the levels that were short were asking you to do something kind of like technical and weird. And as long as you could keep up, you were fine. And then the longer levels usually had repeating patterns that said, this is going to be an endurance test. You need to get smacked in the face a bunch for a minute and a half, and then we'll let you get to your checkpoint. I hated that at first, and then later I was like, okay, I understand why. And you hit it on the head, you know, when you said that afterwards, when you get to some of the shorter levels, you feel like you got your momentum is back.
Yeah, and usually in those shorter levels is where they start pulling out the audio tricks. Like, it's easier to hit the notes generally in those smaller ones, so they kind of throw out the more rhythmic elements, and you kind of feel mastery again, both with audio and with the difficulty, which I thought was pretty impressive. Because some of the segments that are long and protracted would just, at a certain point, maybe it was just the tension that I lost track of kind of feeling the rhythm, and then it would come back later. So hats off to the developers. I thought that it was really well paced.
Hats off to Drool.
Yes, to Drool. All power to Drool. So is there anything else that jumped out to you guys about Thumper?
The last thing I want to hit is sort of a revisitation, if that's even a real word, I don't know. Pete, just don't bust me.
Yeah, I'm not gonna bother looking it up.
Of like how to properly make a game hard. And I had moments of frustration with the game, and I think it wasn't because I needed to add more skill. I think it was because I was just too tired and couldn't memorize a pattern or get into the beat because I was maybe just too tired or something. This is almost a reprise of our Furi discussion, because Gino had a really bad time with parts of Furi because you said, I just have to memorize patterns. There's no skill. I just have to memorize stuff. And I took that point that you made and said, well, I felt something different about it. I felt like if I got in the rhythm, I stopped having to think about patterns, and I just sort of felt the combat, and I could just understand what was happening. I could understand their next move. And here you say you had a better time with Thumper, but there were some parts that I felt kind of how you felt in Furi, where I felt like this game is just throwing more things at me in a shorter time, and all I have to do is memorize like a muscle memory sequence. And I started getting less out of the harder levels. I got so much more out of levels like 3, 4, 5, and 6 because they were hard enough, but they were like I was rewarded appropriately for the difficulty, and I thought that I was getting massive diminishing returns on the later levels because they were just hard to a point where they said this is just supposed to be an insanity level. So good luck, kid, and try to your best to memorize the pattern. So I wanted to see how you felt, Gino and Pete as well, about the scaling difficulty.
Well, before Gino jumps in, I'm sure Gino has some things to say. I want to make a short point, is that I think this idea of diminishing returns applies to the visual style as well. I was entranced by the first level. I was, interested, excited by the second level. And as the game went on and the sort of styles became, except for those boss battles, potentially a little bit more repetitive, I felt the same sense of diminishing returns, which for a game as invested in its visual style as this one is a serious problem.
Yeah, I thought that the visual style came back in levels 7, 8, 9. I thought that's where it really started departing. Like, 8 has a more underwater motif.
Yeah.
And I thought that was a pretty big departure from... and I think 7 has just some kind of... I don't even know how to describe it. It's like spindly white tentacle things that would come off. They looked almost biological.
Those things actually were really cool, now that you mention them. I know what you're talking about.
So in 7, 8, 9, and in 9, it became almost geometric. Like this raw geometry shaping around you instead of kind of metal tentacles. I thought up until then it was kind of metal. It felt almost like a heavy metal album cover was coming out of the track. But by 7, 8, 9, it felt horrifying again. Horrifying and, visually interesting. But for me, the difference was because there were a couple reasons. Because I thought about this. I was like, this game, it's difficult, but it's not pissing me off in the way that Furi did. Why is that the case? And I think some of the reasons were things I talked about with the design. Good checkpointing, like tight checkpointing. You could screw up a couple of times, but as long as you made it past different segments, you were still making progress. So it wasn't just a complete stone wall where you saw no progress at all. You could slop your way through, where if you're not hitting everything perfectly, you can still make progress. If you just say, look, this section's too hard for me, I'm not going to hit any of the arches. I'm not going to do the super slams. I'm not going to try and perfect any of the turns. I'm just going to hold down the X button when I need to. I'm going to thump when I feel like it, and I'm going to not screw up on the turns. That's all I'm going to do. You could do that. Whereas with Furi, if you're screwing up the timings on the blocks, you can't even damage some of the bosses. Like, there's nothing you can do. You're just sitting there and taking damage. And I also thought that because the rhythm in this game was explicit, like, there is a drum beat that is playing in the background, and all the notes are always on beats. Each of the obstacles is essentially a beat. Because that is the case, I could feel what the game wanted me to do when I got into the rhythm, whereas with Furi, it was just kind of a randomized pick from the different animations that this character was capable of performing, happening over and over and over again. And so I couldn't necessarily know which move was coming next just because I, felt the rhythm. I just had to kind of key in on what they were doing and then immediately respond back. It felt more like a Simon Says sort of thing, where it's almost a call and response experience versus a musical rhythmic experience where I'm going along with the game to make some sort of song instead of answering back. And another thing that I just appreciated was that as I played well, the game gave me positive feedback more than negative. Like, you can die, but generally I was playing to try and see how much sound I could get out of it. And it almost feels like an environmental obstacle. Like, you are up against a harsh environment versus Furi, where the bosses are more directly taunting and more saying, they're just saying, like, you can't do it. Whereas Thumper doesn't make any pretense about, you can't do it or this is too hard. It's
Thumper
just
doesn't call you weak. Thumper doesn't call you
Thumper.
inadequate.
No, that fits in with the whole cosmic horror idea that really the cosmos is indifferent, doesn't care whether we live or die, and that's what makes it horrific.
Yeah, and because of that, I never felt as though the game was sneering at my weakness. I never felt like the game was demanding something I couldn't give or was not interested in giving. And so I think it was just a combination of all of those things. It was more forgiving. I liked what the game was asking me to do. Like, when it was all coming together, it felt really good. Versus Furi, where what I was trying to do was get through the person who was in front of me. And whatever I had to do to get through them, I didn't really care. My goal was to get to the end. Versus Thumper, where the moment-to-moment gameplay was a reward unto itself. And even if I wasn't enjoying the whole level, there were usually sequences that, if I hit perfectly, I was like, oh, that sounds really cool. And so I could appreciate it.
So my initial response, and we're not going to just open up the whole Furi discussion again, but I wanted to draw a comparison since you and I had very opposed feelings about Furi, and I think we switched on Thumper, so I think it's neat to talk about. I felt like in Furi, I had to get better and stop thinking in order to play the way I wanted to play. I had to just sort of get in the zone, get in the rhythm, and I don't think I could do that with Thumper. Something that I think is not directly tied to it, but could be a piece of evidence, not the initial indicator, but like a trailing piece of evidence. In theory, you could find a way to play Thumper blindfolded, right? Because I don't think the levels change or randomize in any way. Am I off the mark there?
No,
I think you could if you really memorized everything.
Yeah, it'd be unreasonable to ask any player to do that, but like a bot maybe could get programmed to play Thumper.
It's not like
you couldn't do that for Furi.
Yeah, but I'm just thinking this game. So because it's a rhythm game, some of these segments kind of, there are cues that you don't need any visuals for. Like, when beats should come.
Right.
But you're not guaranteed to know which input the game wants from you. So if you were blind, for example, this game would not be playable.
Right. So
some bigger changes.
Yeah, that mechanically, the point that I was trying to make maybe doesn't quite work, but I think my point is still made, that there's parts of Thumper that are just reading a script, but there's improvisation to be had in a game like Furi, and I got rewarded by that kind of creative improvisation where drilling and memorization left and reaction and instinct took over. I got rewarded for Furi. I never got rewarded like that for Thumper. So that's why I'm feeling something different about Thumper that maybe you're surprised or confused that I am or am not feeling if I liked Furi so much.
So did you ever get to the point, I guess this is an open question to Pete and Billy, did you ever get to the point where you were just rattling through sub-levels one at a time and you weren't getting stuck?
Yeah, I got into rhythms. I got into the zone lots of times. But I didn't get the same reward for it, so I'm trying to say.
There were a few times where I would go through and just sort of hit stuff. But that got more and more seldom as the game went on.
Yeah, because there were some segments that when I was feeling the rhythm, I would just be tearing through sub-levels and not get stuck for, 20 minutes. And it wasn't necessarily because I memorized the track and was better at reading the script. It was because I knew I'm playing level 4, the timing is 4 beats per measure. This is how it has... I'm not, thumping on time because I see the note coming down necessarily, quite so much as I know that this is 4 beats per measure, so it must happen at this time. And so I didn't have to think about when I needed to thump because I knew what the rules were. Versus Furi, where every boss has their own set of rules, and they don't there are tells as to what move they're going to do, but there's no rules explicitly saying, this is what I have to do right now, other than some set-piece moves that they would do once or twice per battle. And I just found that the difference for me was, like I said, call and response versus kind of a larger... it's not orchestral, but a more standard rhythm game experience. And partially, I think it's just because I played a lot of Audio Surf. I've played a lot of Rock Band. I've played a lot of Guitar Hero. All of those games, their visual iconography makes sense to me, and their timings make sense to me. So I don't need to think quite as much as I would in a game like Furi, where action RPG controls, even though they're pretty codified, every game has its own little quirks. This game is made by the people what made Rock Band and what made Guitar Hero, which is what I kind of grew up playing. So it was able to dial, even though there are, differences to how Thumper controls versus those other games, there's enough similarity there that some of my skills were able to port directly over versus a game like Furi or even like, God of War, Devil May Cry. The subtle difference, or Beautiful Joe, the subtle differences in the way the action games control can be enough to screw you up, even if you feel like you've got a mastery of that genre. And that's what threw me with Furi a whole lot, was just like the timings on parries are different in Furi than they are in a God of War. The timing on counterattacks and attack chains is different and more precise and demanding. Dodges are different in that game. The dodge is variable length versus a game like God of War where it's a roll and it's always the same distance.
Mm-hmm.
So I think, they're games that appeal to different types of people. And they have their subtle differences. But the difficulty for me was mitigated by familiarity with the genre and just I appreciated the moment-to-moment experience a lot more.
So there was one other thing that I forgot to mention, but I'll mention it now. I could not let this escape and still be called the Grindfather.
Oh, no.
Earlier in the levels, I think world levels 1 through 4, I think primarily is where I did this. But I was actually grinding for some S rank. And later I stopped grinding for S rank because I didn't want to do it anymore, just because for the purpose of this podcast, I knew that I had to get through the game a little bit quicker so that we could record on time. And I also had to catch up on fucking Final Fantasy 9, which I'm still behind on, but I'm still catching up. But still, they added a feature, and I wanted to throw this back into that sort of what they added as a balance, or not a balance, but like a patch update discussion. They added one more feature that I forgot to mention, is that when you hit the start button, you can hit restart from checkpoint.
Yep.
They added a feature to restart from one level before's checkpoint. And that let you actually replay the previous level, where before you couldn't do that. If you, like, for example, if you were trying to get S rank and you missed one of the very last sequences to throw off your combo chain, you had to hope that you didn't hit your checkpoint because you couldn't restart. You had to restart the whole entire level. But they added an option so you could restart the previous sub-level's checkpoint, which is so cool. Made grinding for S rank very nice. Besides the mind-numbing, maddening grinding for S rank.
Yeah, besides the part where you're grinding for S rank.
Besides the part where it's terrible, it was so nice. And then I had one problem with its UI, which was, and this happens actually to lots of UIs, and I don't know what the cause of it is or what the solution would be, but sometimes UIs, the user interface, like the start menu and stuff, are slow to respond. I would find myself like fucking up really bad in a level that I was trying to S rank and I wanted to restart. So I'd hit the start button, hit the down button, hit like X, but it wouldn't, like, it would be behind. It would lag behind because it would take a minute for the starting to appear. So you'd hit start, have to wait like half a second, and then put your inputs in, wait half a second, because like it wouldn't actually move as fast as your fingers could move. And that frustrates me so much. Because when I want to restart a level, I want to restart the level as fast as my fingers can move. Not as fast as the UI can appear or change from screen to screen.
Fine.
That's like a really super niche small thing, but I hope that one viewer or listener can rescue me and say, oh, that fucking annoys me too. Billy, you're so right and handsome and validated.
I'm sure it's a really common complaint in Russia.
Gotta be.
Yeah. What a very specific problem to have.
Right?
I mean, go into Thumper and try to restart a level in under half a second. You can't do it.
Billy's specific problems, Rothert. All right.
I think I have nothing else.
Any last thoughts on Thumper?
Last thought is, I like rhythm games. I like Thumper's visual aesthetic. Actually, all of its aesthetics I think were really cool. One thing to slightly push back on Pete, but I don't want to like reopen the whole discussion. You said that you were getting diminishing returns on its visual aesthetic after a while. And I think one thing that could be said in opposition was that we had to have a baseline in order for us to focus on the gameplay. If they kept changing the world aesthetic over and over again and make it new and interesting, I don't think they'd have the flexibility to add the difficulty and variety of actual gameplay, because we'd have to grow accustomed to a new environment over and over again. I think they tried to give us new environments with all the like mini bosses, and the final boss usually had different environment than the regular level. But I think for the sort of meaty part of the sub levels, they kind of were forced to be consistent in order to achieve something else they wanted to achieve.
Yeah, I think you're wrong.
All right, fair. Yeah, we can just leave it at that. So my final thoughts are, Thumper was fun. I think I would want to go back and play it under different circumstances where I didn't feel like I was under a pseudo time limit, because we do have a recording schedule. But I want to grind out some S ranks and hit for a couple of leaderboards. That's all that I would want to do more in this game.
Yeah,
maybe not the whole game, but like 1 or 2 levels.
I'd say Thumper was, a pretty ambitious game in what it was trying to do, and I appreciate sort of movement into a new genre. But I would just sort of reiterate the point that Billy just disagreed with. If you play the first 2 levels, I don't think you really need to play the next 8. And that's sort of a damning criticism in my mind.
Yeah, for me, I think that the differences in time signatures and seeing kind of what they do with the different patterns and rhythms was enough to make me want to keep playing. But I can see the visual critique. It's really levels 7, 8, 9 where it really spices it up, and I think that that's probably too little too late. You should probably try to spread some of those big visual changes earlier on in the sequence. But one thing that I didn't mention with the mechanics is when you when you do the super slam, it causes the tentacles and things that are growing out of the track to retreat or to die. And I just really enjoyed kind of beating back the madness.
With your own
way.
madness.
Yes, like when you're playing the game well, there is something about, one, like the game visually becomes a lot more complex. The color scheme becomes brighter. You beat back these horrifying tentacles that they're uncomfortable, and they are visually complex and kind of distract from the rest of the track. It's kind of like the game becomes pure when you're playing it well. The sounds sound better. The track stops having all this bullshit happening all around it. And you're just in the zone, and you're in a sense of flow. And Thumper, when you're playing it well, feels unlike any of the games I've played in a while. So even though I found some of it to be difficult and kind of off-putting, this is probably, like, when we start talking Game of the Year, this is going to be something I'm going to bring up at some point. I'm almost certain. Not for Game of the Year necessarily, but
I mean, maybe a subcategory.
Yeah, some kind of mechanical, because this game is mechanically...
Best rhythm game we played.
Yes.
Nominees: Thumper
and Thumper. Thumper wins.
I want them to import a Mario Kart Rainbow Road level. That would just be dope.
This is like Rainbow Road if Rainbow Road was on drugs.
If it was
Rainbow
also
Road was on drugs.
Yeah.
Just different drugs.
The good drugs, not the bad drugs.
Yeah, this game is like Rainbow Road on like a bad trip.
Rainbow Road's on paranoid. The fun Ellis. Did you guys watch 22 Jump Street?
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know how on one of them, one side Channing Tatum is having the good drug experience, and on the other side, Jonah Hill is having the bad drug experience?
Yeah.
Rainbow Road is the Channing Tatum of these drug sequences.
and Thumper
the
Jonah Hill drug experience.
There you go. I think we can conclude with that perfect metaphor.
Yes. That metaphor has no flaws.
All right, Billy, so it is your turn to pick.
All right, it is my turn to pick.
Oh, wait, actually, before that, remember, if you want to send feedback, at deeplistenspod, deeplistens.libsyn.com. We have comment sections, and deeplistenspodcast@gmail.com. Send us feedback. Billy, go.
For the next game, we are playing Never Alone.
All right.
It is a story, sort of like a side-scrolling platformer game where you play as a young Eskimo female and like a white fox type deal, and you can also play it co-op if you want to, but it's sort of a platforming experience. It looks really cool. It had pretty good reviews. I've had this game in my Steam library for like a year now and just haven't touched it, but I can't wait to play because it looks really, really fun. And anytime I get to pick a podcast game, I just want to play games that are fun.
Sounds
not
good.
games like Silent Hill 4 The Room or Sonic
Final
Chronicles:
Fantasy IX.
The Dark Brotherhood or Charles Barkley Shut Up and Jam Got In.
Sorry, that one was okay.
Silent Hill 4 The Room was okay. It just had a lot of problems.
God, if Silent Hill 4 has to be like the okay tier, Jesus.
It's okay. It's not terrible. Once you get to the back half of the game, it becomes unfun. But as Silent Hill games,
you mean once it starts being a
Silent
Hill game, it stops being fun?
No, it was the Silent Hill game from the start. It's when it starts being this weird escort mission that it stops being fun.
Okay, sure.
I'm sorry. I made you play a horror game.
I'm fine. You also who made us play fucking Until Dawn?
That was Tyler. That was Tyler's fault.
Was Tyler's pick?
Yeah,
Tyler's
Tyler
a great guy. I can't say anything bad about Tyler.
Yeah, and I guess one thing we didn't mention this entire time, VR.
Yeah, well, none of us played it in VR.
None of us played in VR. This game is probably a nightmare to play in VR.
I played in super ultra mega graphics, and it was gorgeous. I played it in a room with the lights turned off, so it was the only thing that I could see. It kind of simulates it.
I just imagine if you like looked away from the track for any seconds at all. Maybe VR would make it a little bit easier to some of the segments where it would like jerk the track around and stuff like that. Maybe that'd be easier in VR.
You could turn.
Yeah, you could turn your head and then be able to look ahead. Maybe. I don't know.
Yeah.
One day I'll play it in VR and then I'll have an answer.
Yeah, and we'll double back.
Yeah. So, thank you, listeners. Next time we are playing Never Alone. And thank you, Billy.
Thanks, everybody, for tuning in. I look forward to playing more good games with you guys.
Thank you, Pete.
Always a pleasure. Make sure everybody comes back around next week.
All right. Till next time, everyone. Peace.